After their disastrous defeat at Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht reached a decisive turning point. They could wait and be pummeled by an impending Soviet offensive, or seize the initiative and launch its own operation to encircle and destroy the Red Army. Adolf Hitler made the decision, and the German leader chose to gamble all of his armored forces and launch a decisive offensive towards Kursk, codenamed Operation Citadel. However, the British informed the Soviets of the precise dates and locations where the offensive would take place. And thus the Battle of Kursk began. Over 2 million men, 6,000 tanks, and more than 4,000 aircraft took part in the world's largest tank battle, where the Germans were outnumbered at least 3-1 in men, supplies, and armored vehicles. The advance was harsh and merciless, yet the Germans fought fiercely against the Soviet army with the resources to exhaust them to the last man, bullet, and tank. The German leader in the Wehrmacht believed at the start of Operation Barbarossa that Moscow would fall to the invincible German army. But they were wrong. They had underestimated the Soviet population. Despite successfully surrounding and annihilating numerous Soviet armies that surpassed 600,000 prisoners of war, the Soviets could still bring fresh troops seemingly from nowhere. As the German army pushed deeper and deeper in the vast spaces of the Soviet Union, their supply networks could not keep up with their blitzkrieg speed. Meanwhile, as the Soviets were pushed back, they adopted a scorched earth tactic, leaving nothing but ashes and rubble to the invaders. They concentrated their forces and counterattacked in significant numbers. Stalingrad then became the embodiment of what combat was like at the Eastern Front. Upon reaching the city in September 1942, the German Sixth Army was taken by surprise due to the overwhelming enemy resistance from both civilians and military. By mid-November, the Red Army managed to cut off and encircle the Sixth Army in the city of Stalingrad. Nevertheless, Adolf Hitler was determined to hold the city at all costs, and so ordered them to hold their ground. The promised supplies and reinforcements failed to materialize, resulting in the loss of thousands of German lives during the brutal winter season. On January 31, 1943, Field Marshal Paulus refused to follow Hitler's orders to fight to the last man and surrendered with his exhausted and starving troops to give them a chance to survive. During the battle, some 250,000 battle-hardened soldiers perished, and more than 90,000 would be sentenced to die in the infamous Soviet gulags. The defeat at Stalingrad became the turning point of the Eastern Front, pushing the Germans back and forcing them to stay on the defensive. Meanwhile, the Soviets took advantage of the momentum and launched Operation Little Saturn, with the goal of encircling and destroying the German forces in the Don River Bend. The ensuing battles broke the lines and left gaps and salients all across the front. A 250 kilometers wide gap opened between German Army Group B and Army Group Don. And the advancing Soviet armies threatened to cut off all German forces south of the Don River, including Army Group A operating in the Caucasus. By April of 1943, the Red Army had retaken Rostov and Kursk, with their offensives at all fronts threatening to break the German lines. Following his victories over the Soviets at Belgorod and Kharkov, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein requested from the Führer unrestricted operational freedom to obliterate the Soviet advance. Once approval was granted, German forces underwent reorganization, and the troops prepared for a large-scale offensive. The operation, codenamed Citadel, and its objective was the capture of the Kursk salient. Operation Citadel called for a double envelopment, directed at Kursk, to surround the Soviet defenders of 5 armies and seal off the salient. Army Group Center would provide General Walter Model's 9th Army to form the Northern Pincer. It would cut through the northern face of the salient, driving south to the hills east of Kursk, securing the rail line from Soviet attack. Army Group South would commit the 4th Panzer Army, under Hermann Hoth, who would to pierce the southern face of the salient. Meanwhile, the Second Army, under the command of Walter Weiss, would contain the western portion of the salient. Manstein's main attack was to be delivered by the II SS Panzer Corps under Paul Hauser. Thousands of troops, vast quantities of ammunition, tanks, and aircraft started pouring into the battlefield. The Germans ultimately assembled a force exceeding 800,000 men, 3,000 tanks, 2,500 aircraft, and 10,000 guns and mortars. The Soviets, fearing that something big was going to happen, did the same and began overproducing as many tanks, artillery, and aircraft as they could. After months of preparations, the Red Army recruited more than 1,005,000 men, 6,000 tanks, 3,000 aircraft, and over 20,000 machine guns and mortars. In April 1943, General Walter Model convened with the Führer to express his concerns regarding the Soviets building defenses around the salient. Simultaneously, the British gathered information from the Enigma machine, alerting the Soviets of the German attack. The Soviets then began building 8,000 kilometers of trenches and 8 defensive lines to repel the German forces. Some German officers wanted the operation cancelled, while others, like Kluge, opted for an immediate attack. In the end, Hitler and Model chose to postpone it and give it more thought. During this time, Albert Speer, Minister of Armament and War Production, explained that the industry would be unable to replace the lost armored vehicles if the offensive took place. To exacerbate the situation, many of the newly introduced Tiger, Panther, and Elephant tanks that would be used for the first time were not yet fully operational. General Heinz Guderian, the master of armored warfare, argued strongly against the operation and told Hitler, quote, "Is it really essential to attack Kursk, and indeed the East, this year at all? Do you think anyone even knows where Kursk is? The entire world doesn't care if we capture Kursk or not. What is the reason that is forcing us to attack this year on Kursk, or even more, on the Eastern Front?" To which Hitler replied, quote, "I know, the thought of it turns my stomach." Nevertheless, Hitler designated July 5th as the official launch date for the offensive. He believed that a successful offensive at Kursk would not only secure valuable territory, but also deal a substantial blow to the Soviet military, potentially turning the tide of the war in favor of Germany. On July 5, 1943, the German offensive began. It actually began with a Soviet artillery barrage that rained down on the German front lines. Unfortunately for the Germans, the day before, captured German soldiers had revealed the exact hour the offensive would begin, so tactical surprise was lost. However, German forces quickly advanced toward the Russian lines, following their own barrage of heavy artillery and mortars. As usual, the advance was spearheaded by the German tank divisions, but the minefields and Soviet resistance slowed them down. The Germans introduced new weapon systems into the battle. Ferdinand tank destroyers, outranging their Russian counterparts, and radio-controlled demolition tanks guided by German pioneers effectively cleared paths through minefields. In the air, the German aces took to the skies to halt the Soviet bomber and fighter attacks despite their disadvantage in numbers. Then the Germans began their own artillery bombardment, which lasted 80 minutes in the northern face and 50 minutes in the southern face. After the barrage, the ground forces attacked, aided by close air support provided by the Luftwaffe. As the days passed, the Germans managed to advance, taking several strongpoints, and even managed to breach the first line of Soviet defenses, but the extensive defensive system slowly eroded the German forces. A lot of German tanks were damaged by mines, and the overwhelming Russian artillery inflicted huge losses upon the German infantry. To the east, during the night of 4 to 5 of July, SS combat engineers had infiltrated no man's land and cleared lanes through the Soviet minefields. At dawn, July 5th, the three divisions of 1st SS Panzer Grenadier Division Leibstandard, 2nd SS Panzer Grenadier Division Das Reich, and the 3rd SS Panzer Grenadier Division Totenkopf attacked the Russian positions. Despite inflicting superior losses to the Soviets, the high kill-death ratio of the Tigers, the Panthers, and the Elephants was not enough to decimate the impetus of the Soviet armor. For every German tank lost, the Soviets had 3 as a backup. The odds were slowly turning against the Reich. Within a week, the offensive came to a standstill. The Red Army counterattacked, but Model held his ground. By July 10th, Model's 9th Army had lost 20,000 men and 200 panzers. Hoth's 4th Army was decimated to just 500 panzers out of 916. Only the elite SS Panzer Divisions Totenkopf, Das Reich, and Leibstandard in the south were still making progress as they reached the village of Prokhorovka. The elite SS Panzer Divisions, led by Hauser, arrived at the Moro and reported to headquarters the sounds of tank engines approaching from all directions. The Germans did not know that Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army was hidden very close to the village, and at 8 a.m., an artillery barrage disoriented the Waffen SS soldiers. Minutes later, Rotmistrov ordered the attack and the tanks rolled in at maximum speed to confront the panzers. German aircraft tried to provide support, but smoke and dark sand of melting buildings and fields made bomb load deliveries inaccurate and less effective. On July 13th, the Führer began withdrawing troops after being notified that the Allies had landed on Sicily, effectively terminating Operation Citadel. The Soviets then launched Operation Kutuzov, a massive counterattack that pushed the Germans beyond Citadel's starting point. In the end, it is regarded that the Germans won the battle when it came to military tactics and the overall performance of their units. Despite being highly outnumbered, they inflicted almost 4 times the number of casualties on the enemy. The casualties suffered by the two combatants are difficult to determine. Historians estimate that the Soviets lost more than 500,000 men while the Germans only lost 200,000. As for equipment, Germany lost more than 700 tanks and never recovered. Meanwhile, the Russians lost around 6,000 tanks and assault guns, but its superior industry quickly made up for them. The campaign was a strategic Soviet success. For the first time, a major German offensive had been stopped before achieving a breakthrough. The Germans, despite using more technologically advanced armor than in previous years, were unable to break through the deep Soviet defenses. Were never able to regain the initiative or launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front ever again. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe to the channel to find more exciting historical content. Let us know in the comments below what you think of the Germans' performance in the largest tank battle of World War II.